There is a truth that most people hear but never fully receive, and yet it carries the power to shift everything inside a human life. It is not a distant idea, not a theory meant only for discussion, but a living reality that touches the very core of your being right now. God is not separate from the one who believes he is not only around you or above you, but working within you, expressing himself through your thoughts, your words, your very breath when you yield to him. The struggle you feel, the weight you carry, the battles that seem to repeat without end are not stronger than this truth, because when this truth becomes real in the heart, something begins to change from within that no human effort can produce. Healing is not only about what happens on the outside, but about what awakens on the inside. When a person realizes they are not alone in their own life, that divine life is not far away, but actively moving through them in ways they may not yet fully understand. The divine life is already within you, not as something distant, not as a force you must travel far to reach, but as a present and living reality that surrounds the very center of your being, waiting to be acknowledged and yielded to in full trust. Because many live as though they are empty vessels trying to be filled from outside, when in truth the fullness has already been placed within them through the presence of God's working Spirit. And when a person begins to awaken to this reality, something inside starts to shift in a way that human reasoning cannot explain, because it is not logic that activates this truth but surrender, a deep inner yielding where self-effort begins to fade and divine expression begins to rise. And the struggle that once felt like carrying life alone begins to lose its grip, because you are no longer seeing yourself as separated from the source of life, but connected to it in every breath, every thought, every movement of faith that rises quietly within the heart. And in this awareness, sickness loses its authority, not because you are trying harder, but because a higher life is now recognized as present within the same body that once felt weak. And this realization is not emotional excitement but a steady inner knowing that changes how you respond to everything. And when fear tries to speak, it is met not with resistance of human strength but with the quiet authority of divine presence already active within you. And this is where transformation begins, not in outward noise but in inward alignment, where the soul begins to agree with what heaven has already established. And as this agreement deepens, the body itself begins to respond to the life flowing through it, because what is spiritual does not remain separate from what is physical when faith becomes alive and active. And many miss this because they are looking for change in the wrong direction, expecting something to come from far away when it has already been placed within their spirit. And the moment you stop separating yourself from this truth, you begin to walk differently, speak differently, and even think differently, because your awareness is no longer rooted in limitation but in divine indwelling power that does not weaken or fail. And even in moments of pain or uncertainty, there is a deeper current underneath everything that refuses to be shaken, and that current is not dependent on feeling but on truth that remains constant regardless of circumstance. And when a person truly begins to rest in this, their words begin to carry weight not because of personality, but because of alignment. And healing flows not as a sudden event only but as a continuous expression of life overcoming decay. And you begin to notice that what once held you captive in fear begins to lose its grip simply because you are no longer agreeing with it inwardly. And agreement is where authority is formed, because what you accept within your inner world becomes what shapes your outward experience. And so He call is not to strive harder but to awaken deeper, to recognize that divine life is not visiting you occasionally but dwelling within you constantly, moving through your thoughts when you allow it, guiding your steps when you yield, and strengthening what once felt broken without struggle or strain. And as this awareness grows, the distinction between what is human effort and what is divine flow becomes clearer, until there is a quiet confidence rising inside that no circumstance can easily silence. Healing begins when you stop seeing yourself as separate from God's working power, because as long as a person continues to look at themselves as isolated, disconnected, or left to fight alone, they remain bound by the limits of human understanding. But the moment that inner veil begins to lift, and the heart starts to perceive that divine presence is not only surrounding them but dwelling within them, something foundational begins to change in the very way they approach life, sickness, family, and every form of opposition. And this change is not a surface adjustment but a deep inward awakening where the soul stops striving to reach something far away and instead begins to recognize what has already been placed within. And in that recognition there is a breaking of old thinking patterns that once kept the mind focused on weakness rather than life. And healing is not first a physical event but a spiritual alignment where agreement is made with truth instead of fear. And as long as a person continues to see themselves as separate, they will always approach healing as something to obtain rather than something to release. But when separation ends in the awareness of divine indwelling, the entire perspective shifts, and the body is no longer viewed as an isolated system fighting alone, but as a vessel through which higher life is already present and active. And this realization carries authority because it removes the illusion of abandonment that sickness often uses as its foundation. And when that illusion is broken, the power it held begins to weaken. Not because of human effort, but because truth has entered the inner place where lies once ruled. And many continue to struggle simply because they are still operating from a divided mindset, believing in God yet still seeing themselves as cut off from His immediate working presence. And this inner contradiction creates delay, confusion, and fear. But when the heart becomes settled in the understanding that divine power is not distant but already within, and actively working through surrender, then even the smallest act of faith becomes powerful because it is no longer an attempt to bring something down from heaven, but a release of what is already within the spirit. And this is where healing begins to manifest in a way that is not dependent on emotion or outward confirmation, because the foundation is no longer feeling but truth, and truth does not shift with circumstance. And as a person continues in this awareness, they begin to notice that the way they speak over their life changes, the way they respond to symptoms changes, the way they confront fear changes, because they are no longer reacting from separation but responding from union. And in that union there is authority that does not come from personal strength, but from divine presence expressing itself through yielded vessels. And sickness begins to lose its dominance not because it is ignored, but because it is no longer given the position of authority it once held in the mind. And instead of speaking from defeat, the heart begins to speak from indwelling life. And that shift is not loud or dramatic in the beginning, but it is steady, like a deeper current underneath the surface of visible struggle. And as that current strengthens, old limitations begin to break in ways that cannot be fully explained by natural reasoning, because what is happening is not merely mental change but spiritual awakening, where the inner man begins to dominate over outward conditions. And this is why separation must be removed in understanding, because separation is the root of fear, and fear is the doorway through which weakness gains influence. But when union is realized, fear begins to dissolve, and what remains is a quiet but powerful confidence that does not depend on what is seen. And in that confidence, healing is no longer something far away, but something unfolding from within outwardly, shaping thoughts, emotions, and even physical conditions as the awareness of divine life grows stronger within the consciousness of the believer. Every weakness in your body responds to the higher life flowing through your spirit, because the body was never designed to rule over the spirit, nor was weakness ever intended to have the final authority over a life that is joined with divine presence. And when a person begins to understand that there is a higher law operating within them, a law of life that is greater than the natural laws of decay, initiation, and disorder, then the way they interpret pain, symptoms, and physical distress begins to change from the inside out, not through denial but through revelation. And revelation is what shifts dominion, because what you truly see inwardly will eventually govern what you experience outwardly. And many remain bound in cycles of weakness, simply because they continue to agree with what their senses report, rather than what divine life declares within their spirit. Yet there is a deeper truth working silently beneath the surface of every believer's life, a life that does not diminish with time, does not weaken under pressure, and does not withdraw in the presence of opposition. And when this life is recognized and yielded to, it begins to influence even the most resistant areas of the human body, not by force as the world understands force, but by authority that comes from origin, because what is born of God carries a governing nature that speaks to disorder and calls it into alignment. And the body, though natural in structure, is not separate from the influence of spiritual reality, and so every cell, every function, every system is ultimately responsive to what governs the inner man. And when the inner man is awakened to divine union, Weakness begins to lose its claim, not because it is ignored, but because it is overshadowed by a greater life that does not coexist in equality with decay, but overrides it by nature. And this is why focus must shift from examining the weakness to acknowledging the indwelling strength, because what you magnify inwardly becomes the environment your body begins to respond to. And many unknowingly strengthen their limitations by continually rehearsing them in thought and speech, giving authority to what was never meant to rule, while the higher life remains present, waiting not to be invited from afar but to be recognized and allowed expression through yielded consciousness. And as this recognition grows, something subtle yet powerful begins to take place where reactions to symptoms change. Fear no longer dictates interpretation, and the mind stops treating every physical signal as a final verdict, because there is now an awareness that another voice is present within, a voice of life that does not panic, does not retreat, and does not agree with decay. And in that inner agreement the body begins to experience a different influence, as though a deeper current is quietly reversing what once seemed fixed. And this is not imagination but the natural response of matter to the governing authority of spirit, when spirit is no longer suppressed by unbelief. And unbelief in this sense is not simply doubt, but separation in perception, where a person still sees themselves as primarily natural rather than spiritually inhabited. And this divided vision weakens the flow of higher life. But when unity is recognized, even in small measures at first, the influence of that life begins to extend into areas that once felt unreachable, and weakness that once dominated thought patterns begins to lose its intensity, not suddenly always but progressively, as though a hidden strength is pressing from within outward. And the more attention is given to that inner strength, the less authority weakness retains, until even physical resistance begins to feel challenged by a deeper reality operating beneath it. And there is a quiet shift in how pain is interpreted, no longer as an absolute declaration but as a temporary condition subject to a higher order of life. And in this awareness, the believer begins to stand differently inwardly, not striving against their body but aligning with the life that already flows within, allowing it to take its rightful place of influence. And as this continues, what once seemed permanent begins to show signs of yielding to something greater that does not operate on human limitation, but on divine nature moving through human vessels without resistance, and even the smallest inner agreement with His truth begins to change the atmosphere of expectation, until the entire focus is no longer on what weakness says but on what the higher life is continuously expressing beneath the surface of awareness, moving through thoughts, shifting perception, altering response, and continuing to unfold in ways that are still being realized within the deeper understanding of the spirit. Faith is not struggle, is agreement with what is already true in the unseen, because many have been taught to think of faith as something forceful, something that strains, wrestles, and tries to persuade heaven to move. Yet real faith is not born out of effort or emotional intensity, but out of inner alignment with a reality that already exists beyond what the natural senses can detect. And when a person begins to understand this, the entire approach to God changes, because instead of trying to reach upward through anxiety and striving, the heart begins to settle inwardly into what has already been finished in the unseen realm. And this settling is not passive weakness but deep spiritual recognition, where the soul stops arguing with truth and begins to agree with it. And in that agreement there is rest, but also authority, because agreement with divine reality is what allows divine power to express itself without resistance. And struggle often comes from divided perception, where one part of the mind believes and another part still listens to fear, symptoms, and circumstances, creating internal conflict that weakens confidence. But faith removes that conflict by bringing the heart into one focus, one voice, one reality. And that reality is not what is seen but what is established in the unseen order of God's will and presence. And when this becomes clear inwardly, prayer itself changes from begging to receiving, from pleading to standing, from uncertainty to quiet certainty, because faith is no longer trying to create something new, but acknowledging what is already complete in the spiritual realm. And many miss this because they equate intensity with spirituality. Yet true spiritual authority is often quiet, steady, and unshaken, not because the circumstances have changed yet, but because the inner perception has already shifted into alignment with divine truth. And when agreement is complete within the heart, even in small measures at first, there is a release that takes place, not from heaven's willingness but from the believer's resistance, and resistance is what often delays the manifestation of what has already been made available. And so faith is not about forcing change, but about removing inner contradiction, where fear once spoke louder than truth. And as that contradiction dissolves, peace begins to rise, not as emotion alone but as spiritual certainty. And in that certainty the mind begins to rest, no longer chasing outcomes or fighting uncertainty, but fixed on the reality that what God has spoken in the unseen is more real than what is temporarily visible. And this is where transformation begins to deepen, because the body, the emotions, and the circumstances are all influenced by the governing state of inner belief. And when belief is unified with divine truth, everything beneath it begins to respond accordingly, not because pressure is applied from human will, but because alignment has been established with a higher law. And that law does not require struggle to operate, it simply responds to agreement. And many continue to experience delay not because divine power is absent, but because inner division interrupts the flow of trust. Yet when trust becomes singular and undivided, faith begins to operate as rest instead of tension, as confidence instead of questioning, and as quiet assurance instead of anxious effort. And in that state the unseen becomes more real than the seen, not through imagination but through revelation, where the heart perceives what the natural mind cannot measure, and that perception begins to govern response, so that, even when symptoms speak or circumstances resist, the inner agreement remains unshaken, because it is anchored in something higher than changeable conditions. And as this anchoring deepens, the believer begins to live from a different center, not reacting to what is visible but responding from what is already established in the unseen order. And in that flow faith ceases to feel like struggle and becomes the natural expression of a heart that has come into harmony with divine reality, that was always present but not always recognized within awareness. When you yield completely, divine power begins to express itself through your words and actions, because partial surrender always produces partial expression, but complete yielding removes the resistance that once limited the flow of what God desires to reveal through a human life. And this yielding is not a momentary emotional decision, but a deep inward submission, where self-rule begins to decrease and divine influence begins to take its rightful place within the thoughts, the will, and the response of a person. And many desire to see power without first allowing surrender. Yet divine order always begins with the breaking of independence, because as long as a person is still controlling their own direction, their own interpretation, and their own reaction, they are dividing influence between self and spirit. But when surrender becomes total, something remarkable happens within the inner life, where the weight of self-effort begins to lift, and a new kind of authority begins to emerge that is not manufactured but received. And in that state words begin to carry a different weight, not because of volume or intensity, but because they are no longer rooted in personal thought alone but in alignment with divine prompting. And actions begin to reflect a different source, where response is no longer driven by fear, reaction, or habit, but by a deeper awareness of what is moving within the spirit. And this is where transformation becomes visible, not because a person is trying to appear spiritual, but because something within them has taken control of expression in a way that is natural, steady, and unforced. And when yielding is partial, there is still mixture, where human reasoning competes with divine leading, and this competition weakens clarity. But when yielding becomes complete, the internal conflict dissolves, and what remains is a singular flow of direction, where thought, speech, and action begin to align without strain. And this alignment is what allows divine power to express itself freely. Because power is never absent, it is only resisted, and resistance is often subtle, hidden in preferences, assumptions, and the desire to maintain personal control. Yet when these layers are surrendered, the inner life becomes like an open vessel, no longer restricting what flows through it. And in that openness there is a new kind of authority that does not rely on human confidence, because it is not born from personality or education or effort, but from union with a higher source that speaks and acts through yielded instruments. And even the way a person speaks begins to change, not through imitation but through transformation, where words carry weight because they are no longer filtered through fear or doubt. And actions become more decisive, not because of human determination, but because inner guidance has become clearer than external confusion. And this clarity produces a quiet boldness that does not need to announce itself, because it is naturally evident in the way a person responds to circumstances that once would have shaken them. And when divine power expresses itself through words, those words do not carry mere opinion but carry influence, because they are connected to a deeper reality that is not limited by visible conditions. And when it expresses itself through actions, those actions are not driven by human ambition but by spiritual direction, where even small steps become significant because they are aligned with something greater than personal understanding. And this is why yielding is not loss but release, not weakening but strengthening, because what is surrendered is not life itself but the control that once limited life from flowing in its fullness. And as this yielding continues, the distinction between human effort and divine movement becomes more clear, until a person begins to recognize that what they once tried to achieve through striving is now being expressed through simple obedience and inner agreement. And in that place the life within begins to shape the life without, not by forceful interruption but by steady transformation that flows through thoughts, speech, and action as resistance fades and divine expression takes its place more fully within the vessel that has chosen surrender over control. What you carry inside is greater than anything attacking you from outside, because most people live as though external forces have ultimate authority, tie over their condition, their peace, and their outcome. Yet the deeper truth is that every external pressure is still subject to the inner reality that governs a life. And when a person becomes aware of what has been placed within them through divine presence, the entire interpretation of opposition begins to change, no longer as something superior or final, but as something temporary and subject to a higher law working within. And this inner reality is not weak or dormant, but living, active, and continually present even when feelings do not recognize it. And many are defeated not because what is outside is stronger, but because they have not yet awakened to what is inside. And the inner treasure is often overlooked while attention is fixed on outward disturbance. Yet what is within carries a higher authority than anything that can be seen or felt in the natural realm. And when a person begins to shift attention from external pressure to internal truth, something begins to stabilize. In their thinking, where fear loses its dominance and confidence begins to rise from a deeper place that circumstances cannot easily touch. And this is not self-confidence but awareness of divine life operating within the human spirit. And that awareness becomes a governing influence that begins to affect how everything else is interpreted, because what once appeared overwhelming begins to appear smaller in comparison to what is now recognized within. And opposition does not disappear immediately in every case, but its authority begins to weaken as inner strength becomes more dominant in consciousness. And this is where many miss the turning point, because they continue measuring reality by what is attacking them rather than what is already established within them. Yet the inner reality is not reactive, it is foundational, and what is foundational always outlasts what is temporary. And as this truth takes deeper root, the mind begins to shift from reaction to stability, from panic to awareness, from fear-driven thought to steady recognition that something greater is already present and working. And even the body begins to respond to this inner awareness in ways that are not always immediately understood, because what governs inwardly eventually influences what is expressed outwardly. And this is why focus is critical, because attention strengthens what it rests upon, and when attention is constantly placed on external attack, the sense of weakness is reinforced. But when attention is turned toward the inner reality of divine presence, strength begins to rise in perception first, and perception is the beginning of transformation, because what is seen inwardly eventually shapes what is experienced outwardly. And this is not imagination but alignment, where inner truth begins to correct outward interpretation. And as this alignment grows, the voice of fear begins to lose clarity, no longer sounding absolute or final, but instead becoming background noise against a string. Ongoing inner knowing, and this knowing does not depend on emotion, because emotions fluctuate, but inner reality remains constant. And when a person begins to live from what is within rather than what is attacking from without, there is a quiet authority that begins to develop, not aggressive or forced, but steady and unshakable, because it is rooted in something that cannot be moved by external conditions. And even when pressure increases externally, the inner life remains unchanged, and this stability begins to influence response, so that reactions are no longer immediate panic but measured awareness, not denial but confidence in something deeper. And over time this inner strength becomes more recognizable than external threat, until the awareness of what is within becomes the dominant reference point for how life is understood, and in that place opposition no longer defines identity or direction, because identity is now anchored in what is carried within, not what is coming from out. And what is carried within is not dependent on circumstance but on divine presence that does not weaken under pressure, does not withdraw under attack, and does not diminish with time, but continues to operate as an unchanging reality within the one who has begun to recognize it as greater than anything that stands against them from the external world.